Our next presenter is Dr. Terri MacDonald, and I'll quickly read her bio as well. Dr. MacDonald is the Director of Policy and Research with the National Tertiary Education Union, or NTEU, which represents the interests of some 30,000 higher education workers. Terri has worked across a broad spectrum of issues that the NTEU has a public policy interest in, including higher education regulation and funding, academic freedom, workplace rights and conditions, including around the proliferation of precarious work, student participation and representation, international education, university research and development, and gender equity. She has authored many submissions, articles, and commentaries, and advises on the union's political advocacy and sector engagement. Prior to working with the NTEU, Terri worked in the university sector both as a professional staff member and as an academic. Terri represents the NTEU's interests on a number of committees, including the federal government's Education Visa Consultative Committee and the ACTU's Women's Committee. Terri, welcome.
Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak. I very much appreciate that. And it's been a really interesting morning, actually, sitting listening to the speakers that we've had previously. It's been quite useful, in a sense, for me to hear of the research which is going on. I'm going to be able to put a little bit of a different spin on things, coming from a trade union where we actually are negotiating around these issues. So this is a fairly general one, and of course we've covered a lot of this data. We love data. We love research, we love data, and look, I'm a policy wonk, so I love data especially. But essentially, you know, we've heard this morning, the numbers speak for themselves. And what I'd really like to highlight in there, of course, is the cost. Now, we talk about, you know, the need to improve gender equity in the workplace. We need to have better working conditions, improved, work rights. But even just looking at it from a purely economic point of view, it makes sense to address these issues. What strikes me as one of the leading reasons for women to leave the workforce 7 years before men is because, you know, many of them are suffering or dealing with issues around menopause and other related challenges. And, you know, they don't want to disclose, they don't feel comfortable, there isn't a support mechanism there, and so it's much easier to exit the workforce. Now, what that means is we're losing these women in particular when they're at their peak in their careers. You know, they've spent all this time working through their careers. They have a great deal of knowledge and skills, and we're seeing those people leave early. So just from a purely economic, you know, productivity point of view, it makes sense for us to start looking at these issues. Now, the ACTU is taking an interest in this, and their latest survey on Work Shouldn't Hurt, which is an annual survey, the third iteration will be released soon, looked at menopause and menstruation in the workplace as one of the issues that we asked women about. Now, what's really interesting about this is that while there was a large percentage, 42% of people who responded saying, look, it's not relevant to me because, this was a general population sample, there were statistically significant numbers of women who said, well, actually, yes, it is a problem. I'm more stressed, less patient with others. The brain fog is something which, you do have to deal with, and yet it's difficult to explain that, particularly to, fellow employees, so your co-workers or to your boss. Tiredness, fatigue, we all know about that. It really does have an impact on your ability to concentrate and perform at your best. So now, as we've heard previously, thank you, existing leave provisions are not sufficient, particularly what's available at the moment under the Fair Work Act. Look, they're inadequate to deal with what we're looking at, in the workplace. Our view is that there should be uniform legislation as standard, allowing for additional days under the Fair Work Act. That is our position, and we're quite happy to take that. Ideally, we would like to see women given 12 extra days a year. Now, not everybody, as we heard originally from Mary this morning, of course, where that has been in place, not everybody accesses those. But there are cases where you might need more than one day. You know, you might be having, you might need 2 or 3 days, for a particular, if you're having a particular, reaction to symptoms that you've got happening. And that's just part and parcel of dealing with things. We believe this is a crucial step in addressing the gender inequity in the workplace that does exist, even in feminised industries like higher education, where I come from, where 58% of the workforce are women. We still have a significant gender inequity and a gender pay gap. And we see a lot of senior management and executives, of course, are where executive roles are where women are underrepresented. So it echoes, what we see elsewhere in the workforce. Okay, so we touched on this morning very quickly too what happens in other countries. Now, what's really interesting about this, as was known this morning, as was said this morning, is this is not a new idea. It might be a new idea for us in many respects, but in places like, South Korea, Indonesia, I think in Japan, it's been in place since the 1940s. So, these kind of this recognition that there are, issues that should be addressed in the workplace around women's reproductive rights is something which is not necessarily, a new concept. Of course, Spain, has just come this year through with their menopause and menstruation leave of up to 5 days a month, which in itself is quite revolutionary. And I did put up there a little bit about, the paper, an excellent paper by, Professor Marion Bard, Elizabeth Hill and Sydney this morning. That is a very good paper. Okay, now, so our view, trade union, is that there is a need for reform. And we do think that it's time that legislation was redrafted to properly acknowledge the fact that, half the population are women, and this is not, a special or isolated thing. This is something which is fairly commonplace. And that these are factors which, often can, force women out of the workforce early, or make it difficult for women to remain in the workforce. And that there needs to be discussion around the proper rights for women to, apply for, and for not to omit those who are in insecure or precarious work, because that in itself is another discussion. So, bargaining for menstruation and menopause leave. This is something which I'm sure some people will be very interested in. So the NTU, this is our current round of bargaining, where we're going through all the different universities and higher education providers and workplaces related to higher education, and many of our bargaining teams have menstruation and menopause leave as something that they're pushing for. However, it's worth noting that we first achieved a clause related to menstruation, menopause, particularly menstruation, in 2006. And that was with the Sydney University Student Representative Council. And it was interestingly classed as stress leave. And you could have up to 12 days a year allocated to that. And the interesting part of it being seen as stress leave was that there was recognition in that instance of it being a psychosocial, risk or hazard, or issue. It wasn't seen as sick leave, and it was in addition to existing sick leave. So this was 12 days, which was standalone in this agreement. Now, moving forward to date, 7 of our current agreements have some form of reproductive, menopausal or menstruational leave noted in it. And, there are varying ways of doing it. Tends to be around the 5 days that we've achieved so far. Although when it's part of something else like life leave, it's up to 10 days. So there are provisions that we're beginning to move on. Unfortunately, none of these yet apply to casuals, which is a separate issue, as universities are highly casualised. But there are other things happening in that space at the moment too. So we have put put forward various different types of claims. And the intentions of these claims are very much to remove the stigma, to improve understanding, to educate around these issues, to sort of make it clear that this is something that's not, should be whispered about, that people can actually, say, look, I'm having, these issues and, this is how I want to deal with it, and to have the employer say, yes, that's quite reasonable. Now, we did look at, for example, Northern Territory is one that we've dealt with recently, but it's also across the board in other institutions where we've managed to achieve these. So this is our kind of ideal clause. This is the clause we would like to see, okay? And it touches on a few things. So firstly, it is self-regulatory. It's self-care. So that gets around the issue of disclosure. And it recognises that menopause and menstruation, when there are issues around that, it's at varying levels. You can have low level and low impact on your work, your working ability. So that might mean that you just might need 15 minutes of quiet time. You might need to be able to get up, walk around, grab that hot water bottle, whatever it is, and just sort of like, deal with it, in your own way. Okay. And then you've got moderate level and low impact. And that means that, you still have an ability to complete the work, but not necessarily in a work environment, in the office environment. That it's much better that, you're able to do your work, but you do it from home, where if you need to lie down for 20 minutes or so, that's fine. And then you've got another level, which is sufficient impact that they're not capable of working for a period of time, because the symptoms that you're having are quite, impactful. They're quite severe. And that's where you might, need to draw upon personal leave. Again, ideally, we'd like 12 days. Now, I'm going to talk about some of the responses we've had when we've been pushing these clauses, because it's important for people to understand it. So initially, there are some responses where, this is an ambit claim from a trade union. It's like, well, no, we're actually serious. This is something we want. There's always the thought, there's always the allegation, well, people will just use this to have extra holidays, and that's what sick leave is for. My favourite is that it discriminates against men, and I'm happy to talk to anybody about that who thinks that might be the case. It'll cost the institution money. Now, this actually does have some validity as an argument. However, when you look at the productivity that's involved with this, you look at the reputational gains that's involved with this, you look at being able to keep those high-performing women in particular in the workplace for longer, then that does counter a lot of those concerns. And it's worth noting that we have been here before. When we first raised the issue of paid maternity leave, or parental leave as it is now, and carers leave. And more recently, when we've started talking about family and domestic violence and intimate partner leave. And that's something now which is becoming quite accepted, as a form of leave. But 10 years ago, we had that conversation, we started pushing that, and we had a lot of pushback from employers. However, now it's being regulated in terms of, federal government legislation. And that's how far we've come. So we've also been consulting with our members and stakeholders. And it's worth noting that there has been some resistance there too to the idea. Like women, for example, are hesitant to take for fear of being singled out. Now, there is some validity to this. And we've seen this happen in some cases where women have wanted to access family and domestic violence leave, where they've accessed it, they've found that they've been, essentially sidelined in terms of their career. They've missed out on opportunities for promotions because they've been seen as being, overly stressed or, not able to handle things. And that is a concern. And the only way that you can deal with that is to destigmatise these things, which again, we have to have those conversations about. There are other things, of course, you can just use sick leave, etc. Well, that might be fine for you, but it's not necessarily fine for the next person who's dealing with these issues. We did, however, get a lot of support, particularly from women and older women, and they've been saying, look, I suffered a great deal, but I haven't felt comfortable talking about it. I don't think it'll be well received by my manager or my boss, and particularly older women who, have a reputation in their institutions, and are at that point in their career where they're, quite senior. They don't want to be seen as, potentially having, been dealing with these issues that, might, relate to them not being able to, might impact on their performance or be seen to impact on their performance. Okay, just leave that last bit there. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of what has been provided for in an NTU negotiated agreement. Considering what we would ideally like, this is one that we've agreed to. And this has come from University of Queensland agreement. Now, just to note, this is yet to go to the Fair Work Commission, but it has been endorsed by the NTEU. So we're in those last stages. So this is the first time that this sort of clause is being outed a little bit. Now, it's specifically called reproductive health and wellbeing leave. We have labelled it as such. It is there. And we have defined what it is for. So it's very clear it is for, perimenopause, menopause, menstruation, a whole range of reproductive, health issues. So that in itself is quite useful. It extends to continuing to employees and, importantly, fixed-term employees, because we have the most, casualisation is a huge problem in universities, but the predominant form of employment is through fixed-term contracts, particularly if you're a researcher. So this is actually quite important. Now, what we've been able to achieve is 5 days. And annoyingly, you do have to exhaust other forms of leave. So that is something for us to deal with. That's another step for us to go in the next round of bargaining, is to address those kind of restrictions. And there is, requirements to provide notice, and an employee may be asked to provide evidence, or to provide, justification. Now, that word may is very important because it's not will, and that allows some flexibility within that clause for us to start moving towards the self-care, model of this form of leave. Now, summary of some of the challenges we've experienced. Again, non-acceptance that menstruation, menopause and other issues around it is an issue in the workforce, that it's an industrial issue. This is despite the research and the data and everything else that we've seen today that shows very much that is not the case. There are concerns over what they consider to be imagined costs, in the same way that we originally heard that paid parental leave would be unreasonably costly, that family and domestic violence leave would cost employers a great deal. And yet the evidence in all of those is that is not the case. Women are not taking, huge amounts of these leave, chunks of leave. If anything, we're seeing underutilisation of it. And that's a different matter, which we have to deal with in a different way. A big one is seeing menstruation and menopause as an illness, rather than an aspect of everyday life for half the population in the world. And that, women in particular, need to be able to, see that as a normal thing, as opposed to it being, considered to be, an illness. And then finally, describes of it as leave, the idea of cost and imposition. So we do talk about leave, but employers see leave as, a negative, when really it needs to be seen in the context of being a support process, to have better workplaces, to have better engaged employees, to have better productivity, to have all of these benefits for what is actually a relatively minor cost. And where to from here? Okay, so we are looking at this issue in the trade union movement. We are making headway. We are coming up with agreements, where we're negotiating agreements where these are being embedded. So the movement is happening. We are already in the thick of that. The ACTU has just established a working group on this, and they are looking at it. They are talking to their affiliates, of which we are. The NTEU is an affiliate of the ACTU, and we're providing information to them around it. So this is something that we are taking seriously. It's not just us, but other unions out there, particularly a lot of our blue collar unions. The Rail and Bus and Transport Union, I think, is one of them, where they are making headway in these areas too. So it's not just, the office worker professional staff. It's, unions, it's elsewhere as well. And finally, we've now got government paying attention. And that's very exciting because that means there's opportunities for us to really make some changes and potentially even revisit the Fair Work Act and what's happening in there and make this something that potentially you could have as an employment standard. So on that note, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. Any questions?
Yes, sorry, I hate to be the person in the room who's going to ask this.
That's right.
Noted under 50.6a under the slide, the definitions of what is actually covered under reproductive leave. The reason I'm here today is because I believe with 110% of my being that this absolutely needs to be addressed. But what's notably absent under reproductive leave was anything to do with male issues. Was that a deliberate? And so this is not a question that's being directed at you. I suppose it's more for the forum as well. Is there a reason that we're not including that when we're looking for clauses within agreements that provide for this?
Yes.
I've seen one where it actually provides for even vasectomies and the likes. Is there a reason why we wouldn't actually be pursuing that aspect of it while we are, again, 110% pursuing all these issues that we've been discussing today?
Yeah, look, there are, I'll answer that in two ways. So firstly, a lot of our clauses are talking about life leave, and, health-related leave, which you would have seen, on the slide that I put up. That's up to 10 days in a lot of our agreements. Now, potentially those would also make allowances for what you're describing, okay? The difference between those issues and what we see in terms of menstruation and menopause is that these are repetitive issues that happen over, many years. So, for women, you go through, of course, your menstruation, and every woman experiences that in a different way. Some women cruise through it. Other women, you're hugging the hot water bottle for 5 days. It depends, and that can vary in itself. And then, of course, menopause isn't something that happens just, in a period of 6 months. It goes on for many, many, many years. So those kind of things have an impact on, and because they're repetitive and they're reoccurring and they happen, a lot, they have a sort of a different sort of, they need to be addressed in a different way. That is not lessening what you're talking about at all.
And I actually appreciate that.
Yeah.
I think that actually means a lot of things.
Yeah, that's cool. But I'm happy to talk about it.
Yeah.
That's okay.
I did note there, though, that clause did say and other forms of assisted reproductive health services. So I assume that would cover things like vasectomies and whatnot.
Yeah. So that we are sort of putting these clauses in a way so that, it's capturing as much as we can around the reproductive health, area issues. Notwithstanding, though, the main premise that menopause, menstruation and all, those issues happen in a repetitive way.
Anyone else?
Is there any definitive study that shows that the reason for women's taking early retirement is related to this menstruation and menopause?
Okay, so we heard this morning that there needs to be more research in that area. And what we're looking at is what is out there currently, which, when we've spoken to women anecdotally ourselves, our members, we have been told that these are one of the reasons that they're looking at early retirement from the workforce, The problem is that this is an understudied area. And we need to have more research on that. So we are more than happy to see that happen. But the analogy is, that women are removing themselves from the workforce 7 years earlier. A lot of women would like to, retire, but they can't because of financial reasons. So they're pushing through it. But if there was the right support there, particularly around, menopause symptoms, then we think that, a lot of that stress that these women are particularly, experiencing would actually be dealt with in a much better way.
I'm just going to add that I love what you're doing. It's amazing. But the endometriosis
Yes.
Association do a lot of research, or trying to do more research in this space as well.
Yes.
So that does evidence the need for this kind of leave.
Yes.
Sure.
And endometriosis, sorry, I'm having trouble with words today. It's a lot more common than people think. And it really is it can be really quite debilitating. So yes.
Yeah, I suffered with that, and I find this very interesting this whole day. It's like endometriosis and menstruation, but
It's
they're very
closely linked.
They're very linked.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just.
Yeah, and where you've got situations where women have actually elected to deal with endometriosis by having everything removed essentially, then they go through menopause.
Yeah.
An early menopause. So you're going from one to another, and dealing with menopause as a young woman is not a great deal of fun. At any age, but particularly when you're younger.
Great. Thank you very much for your presentation, Terri. There's a lot of great work that you're doing to progress this. There was one bit that you touched on around exhausting the other leave.
Yes.
How does that really work for the mechanics if you sort of then, you need your carers leave?
Yeah, look, and this is a problem that we have because women in particular are seen as the primary carers in their family. So you're the one that usually has to take the time off when there are sick kids or and it's not just children, it could be parents, it could be, other relatives that you have a care obligation for. And what tends to happen is women use all their carers leave up very quickly. There's situations they use up, if they're able to use their sick leave, for caring leave as well. And we see a situation where women end up with no leave to take care of their own personal health issues. So that I think is valid and important. Ideally, they would like to see it as a separate standalone leave. And again, that's something we're going to be pushing for. We don't get to these things usually, in the first round of bargaining. It usually takes us a while to get there. We saw it with paid parental leave. We're seeing it with family domestic violence leave. We will see it with this, but we will continue to push for that.
Thank you. Any final questions? Okay, thank you so much,
Thank you
Terri.
so much.
Thank you so much.